I'd like to show you a short but more complicated version of assigning a field based on different values for different input variables. It's similar to the video earlier that I showed that gives you a path for selecting and then assigning the deciduous tall, deciduous short, conifer tall, conifer short categories, different values for rainfall interception. Remember, I have different interception depending upon the combinations. And so in this previous video for this canopy interception using a long method, I'll select first one, so I'll select the canopy short and type equal height, and then I'll assign a value. This expression here is 0.0032 to intercept. And I'll do that again for the next one. I'll select the canopy deciduous and tall, and I'll assign a different value for the interception, 0.0064, and I just apply those selection and assigns 4 times in a row, and I get this long block of code. That's okay, that works fine, it's a lot to write, and it's simple and straightforward to understand. I'm just doing what I would do manually, but I'm doing it repeatedly until I get all the intercepts assigned. In this previous video, we showed that that works. I can do the same thing in a shorthand notation, but it's a much more complicated syntax in that the calculate field also contains an expression that does the comparison and assignment for me, and so I'll go through that. This is often something you'll do when you want to do something shorthand. You're doing simple sorts of assignments, but it's tricky to get the syntax right because Arc and Python are pretty unforgiving, and if you get even a colon or a single equal instead of double equal or anything in the syntax wrong, it just won't run, and it doesn't tell you very well where the issue is. It's not a very informative debugger. But nonetheless, this is useful enough to simplify our code. I want to go over it. So we have a data layer here, this in-canopy data layer, and you can see that I've assigned the in-canopy is basically a copy of my tree canopy layer. I just made a copy of what we've been using, and I want to assign the intercept based on a code block. The code block defines an assign int function, and it says in this assign int function, take a form and a size and do this code and return values for that intercept depending upon the values that are passed. So I'll come with a row, and the row might have a deciduous type that's short. So it'll go through here and find the deciduous short and return that value and assign it for that row, and go to the next row and apply this function again. So row by row, it goes down and applies this function. The function has this form where I do a def in the code block, then the function name, then I give it the variables that are going to be used. These are placeholders, and those correspond to these variables that I pass in to the function. Notice the variables, when I pass them in here, have to have the exclamation points on both sides. But if I double click on the variables, type assign int, and then the parentheses and double click on the variables, it puts those in there. And then I put a comma, and then I double click on the next variable, and it'll put that in there, and then I have to close parentheses. So I have to have this written correctly or formed correctly for this function to be applied correctly, this code block. And this uses an if-else syntax. And so it says if the size equal to tall, and the double quotes are important here because this is a text variable, so I have to have that there. If it were an integer variable or a numeric variable, I wouldn't have the quotes there. If form equals to deciduous, so it says if this is the case, then it goes and does the next thing. It says, well then, if this is also the case, so if it's tall and deciduous, return the 0.0064. That's the interception value associated with tall deciduous. Else if form equals conifer, now it's still on the tall if. So it says, if it's tall and deciduous, give it this. If it's tall and coniferous, give it this. So it's looking at the tall versions, decid conif, and it returns the values back. If it's not tall, it does the next one. It says if size equals short, right? So it's not tall, size equals short. Then it says if it's short, if the form is deciduous, return the deciduous value. If the form equals coniferous, return the coniferous value. Else, return 0. If it's none of these, if it's not short or tall, it just returns 0. I could have returned -9999 or some other flag. I just put 0 in here. And again, you have to be careful to have, after these ifs, you have the test in parentheses, And the test input is easy. It's nested here again, an if, then an if. And then there's a returned value, and then there's no colon after the return. There's a colon after these two to say, oh, it's continuing. But that means that's the end of this statement here. Then it goes to the else if, elif. Also, indenting is important. You have to have the proper indentation in Python. It uses that to help define code blocks. So if you have this form for a relatively simple one or two variable comparison, it works. It's sometimes tricky to get it right. The things people most often do is either misplace colons or don't put in colons or don't have a single equals, or they'll not do the double quotation marks like they need, or they'll mess up on the indenting. And then also you got to remember to get this form here matching the defined form, the definition. So that's okay. I've set this up. If I validate it and then if I run it, it runs through fairly quickly and does the assignment. And we can see then that it's assigned our interception values correctly. So it's something to use to experiment with, sometimes especially when you have multiple long instances, like in here, it can be tough to debug and you can name things wrong or misdirect things. So if you have a piece of code like this that works, it makes for a smaller model. It may be more of a bear to decode right the first time if you have a new version, but then once you've got it figured out, you can usually copy and paste or use it as a model in order to do your selection. So either works. Hope this helps.